The German Shepherd's growl filled the sterile hospital room as the nurse's hand hovered over the IV line. His sharp teeth flashed, and everyone froze. Nurse Sarah Collins had worked at St. Mary's Hospital for 3 years, and she'd never encountered anything like this. The massive dog, his black and tan coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights, stood rigid beside the hospital bed. His amber eyes locked onto her hand with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her professional training. "I just need to check your handler's IV, but Rex, according to the chart clipped to the bed, wasn't having it." The 80-pound German Shepherd positioned himself like a living barrier between the nurse and the clear plastic tubing that fed life-sustaining medication into Officer Daniel Hayes's arm. Every muscle in the dog's powerful frame was coiled tight, ready to spring. The patient lay unconscious, his face pale against the white pillows. Bandages wrapped around his torso where shrapnel had torn through his bulletproof vest during a raid gone wrong. The monitors beside his bed beeped steadily, tracking his vital signs as he fought to recover from injuries that had nearly claimed his life. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Martinez, the attending physician, stepped into the room just as Rex's growl deepened. "What's the situation here?" "The dog won't let me near the IV." Sarah explained, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine confusion. "I've worked with service animals before, but I've never seen behavior like this." Dr. Martinez frowned, studying the scene. Rex's hackles were raised, a clear sign of agitation that seemed directed specifically at the nurse. When other staff members had entered throughout the day, the dog had remained calm, watchful but not aggressive. But with Sarah Collins, something was different. "Maybe he's just stressed from being in the hospital environment," Dr. Martinez suggested, though uncertainty-colored. His voice, "These police dogs are trained to be protective." Rex's ears flicked forward, and he shifted slightly, placing himself even more firmly between the nurse and his handler. The dog's gaze never wavered from Sarah's face, as if he could see something that no human eye could detect. In that chilling moment, no one in the room understood what they were witnessing. They saw an overprotective animal refusing to let medical staff do their job. They couldn't know that Rex's highly trained senses were picking up subtle chemical traces that didn't belong, scents that spoke of danger in a language only he could comprehend. What was wrong with the IV? Why would a service dog trained to obey suddenly defy protocol with such determination? And why did his amber eyes stay locked on the nurse, with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul? The hospital staff exchanged worried glances. This was no ordinary patient situation. Officer Daniel Hayes wasn't just another injured man fighting for his life. He was a key witness in a corruption case that had already claimed 2 lives, and Rex, his faithful canine partner, seemed to be the only one who understood that the danger hadn't ended when the explosion threw Daniel onto that hospital gurney. "I'll try a different approach," Sarah said, moving to the other side of the bed. But Rex was faster, his powerful legs carrying him around the bed with fluid grace. Once again, he positioned himself as a living shield, his warning growl vibrating through the room like a low rumble of thunder. The tension in the sterile air was palpable. Other patients in nearby rooms had begun to notice the commotion, their worried faces appearing in doorways as Rex's protective stance intensified. The usually quiet medical ward had become the stage for a confrontation that none of them understood. Dr. Martinez made a decision that would later save a man's life, though he didn't know it at the time. "Let's leave the IV adjustment for now," he said, noting the dog's unwavering vigilance. "We can monitor the patient's condition and reassess later." Sarah's face tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that Rex caught even if the humans missed it. "The medication schedule is important for his recovery," she insisted. "Perhaps we could have someone from animal control." "No." The word came out sharper than Dr. Martinez intended. Something about the situation felt wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The dog stays with his handler. That's department policy for injured officers. As the medical staff filed out of the room, Rex remained at his post. His amber eyes followed Sarah Collins until she disappeared down the hallway, and only then did his rigid posture relax slightly. He padded back to the chair beside Daniel's bed, but his alertness never fully faded. The German Shepherd had been trained to detect explosives, track suspects, and protect his handler in the most dangerous situations imaginable. But now, in the seemingly safe environment of a hospital, those same instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong. Rex settled beside his partner's bed, his massive head resting on his paws, but his ears remained pricked forward. Every footstep in the hallway, every voice that carried through the thin walls, he catalogued it all, waiting and watching. They thought they were dealing with a routine medical treatment, complicated by an overprotective animal, but they were about to learn that Rex had uncovered something no human could sense. A conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the institution they trusted to heal the wounded. The night shift was coming on, and in the gathering darkness outside the hospital windows, other forces were moving. People who had tried once to silence Officer Daniel Hayes were preparing to try again. And the only thing standing between a good man and certain death was a German Shepherd whose loyalty ran deeper than training, deeper than instinct. Rex had saved his handler's life in dark alleys and dangerous raids. Now, in the sterile corridors of St. Mary's Hospital, he would be called upon to do it again. 5 years earlier, Officer Daniel Hayes had been a rookie cop with dreams of making a difference when he first met Rex at the K-9 training facility. The German Shepherd was barely 2 years old, then all energy and intelligence waiting to be channeled into purpose. Their instructor, Sergeant Murphy, had warned the new handlers that the bond between officer and K-9 wasn't automatic. It had to be earned through trust, consistency, and countless hours of training. "This dog will become your partner in every sense of the word." Murphy had told Daniel that first day, "He'll trust you with his life, and you'll trust him with yours, but that trust starts here in these training yards, not out on the streets." Daniel remembered the first time Rex had looked at him with recognition, not just as another human, but as his human. It had been during a tracking exercise in the woods behind the facility. Rex had been following a scent trail when he suddenly stopped. Ears perked, body tense, Daniel had learned to read the dog's signals by then, and something in Rex's posture told him they weren't alone. 3 armed suspects had been hiding in a ravine, waiting to ambush the training exercise. Rex's alert had given Daniel the seconds he needed to call for backup and prevent what could have been a disaster. From that moment, the bond between them had been unbreakable. Now Daniel lay in the hospital bed, his body broken, but his spirit tethered to one unshakable presence. Rex, the dog, had refused to leave his side since the moment the paramedics had wheeled Daniel through. The emergency room doors hospital policy usually prohibited animals in patient rooms, but Captain Morrison had pulled strings invoking department regulations about injured officers and their K-9 partners. The explosion that had nearly killed Daniel still played in Rex's memories like a nightmare that wouldn't fade. They had been pursuing a suspect through an abandoned warehouse when the world had suddenly erupted in fire and twisted metal. The blast had thrown Daniel 30 feet, his body ragdoll limp as he crashed into a stack of shipping containers. Rex had been closer to the explosion, his keen hearing picking up the subtle click of the trigger just moments before detonation. His powerful legs had carried him toward his handler, and he'd tried to shield Daniel from the worst of the blast. The flying debris had left Rex with minor cuts and burns, but Daniel had taken the brunt of the explosive force in the hours that followed as paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Daniel's condition. Rex had paced the hospital corridors like a caged wolf. The veterinarian who examined him found no serious injuries, but the dog's distress was obvious to anyone who looked. He whined constantly, his amber eyes searching every face for answers about his handler's condition. The hospital staff had noticed Rex's devotion from the beginning. "That dog won't even eat unless his handler is awake," Nurse Patricia Williams had whispered to her colleagues. It was true. Rex had refused food for the first 3 days, accepting only small amounts of water when Daniel's condition began to stabilize. Dr. Martinez had been amazed by the animal's behavior. In his 20 years of practicing medicine, he'd seen family members keep vigil beside loved ones, but he'd never witnessed loyalty quite like this. Rex slept on the cold tile floor beside Daniel's bed, his body positioned so that he could monitor both the door and his handler simultaneously. Every footstep that approached, every voice that carried down the hallway, Rex catalogued it all with the thoroughness of a trained sentinel. The dog's presence had actually helped Daniel's recovery in unexpected ways. During the moments when the officer drifted toward consciousness, the sound of Rex's breathing or the gentle pressure of a massive paw against his hand seemed to anchor him to the world of the living Dr. Martinez had read about. Therapy animals, but this was something deeper. A connection that transcended the typical boundaries between human and animal. Detective Sarah Chen from Daniel's precinct had visited regularly, bringing updates about the corruption case that had led to the warehouse explosion. The investigation was complex, involving several officers who had been taking bribes from a drug trafficking organization. Daniel had been gathering evidence when someone had tipped off the suspects about the raid. "He's the key witness," Chen had explained to Dr. Martinez during one of her visits. "Without his testimony, we might not be able to prosecute." There are a lot of people who would benefit if Daniel Hayes never made it to the courtroom. Rex seemed to understand the gravity of the situation in ways that went beyond normal canine comprehension. His vigilance had intensified over the past week, and his behavior had become increasingly protective. He allowed the regular medical staff to perform their duties, but he watched everything with the intensity of a professional bodyguard. But late one night, during the quiet hours when the hospital corridors were dimly lit and most patients were sleeping, Rex had reacted strangely to something no human could perceive. A quiet, almost invisible shift in the IV bag had made his ears twitch. His gaze had darted from Daniel's pale face to the figure adjusting the drip. And from that moment, Rex had refused to let anyone touch the line without exhibiting signs of extreme agitation. The first time it happened, the night nurse had dismissed it as random behavior. "Sometimes animals get confused in hospital environments," she had explained to the security guard who responded to reports of a disturbance in room 314, but Rex's behavior wasn't random, and it wasn't confusion. His nose, trained to detect minute traces of explosives and drugs, was picking up chemical signatures that didn't belong in a medical setting, scents that spoke of tampering of substances that had no business being in an IV bag, meant to heal rather than harm. The German Shepherd had learned to trust his instincts through years of police work. Those same instincts had saved Daniel's life during the warehouse explosion, giving him the EQ split-second warning that had allowed him to partially shield himself from the blast. Now, in the sterile environment of the hospital, those instincts were screaming that danger was present again. Daniel's condition had been steadily improving until, recently, the doctors were optimistic about his recovery, expecting him to regain full consciousness within days. But during the night shifts, when fewer staff members were present and the corridors were quiet, something was happening that was reversing his progress. Rex had begun to notice patterns. Certain staff members triggered no response. They could check Daniel's vital signs, adjust his pillow, even change his bandages without incident. But when specific individuals approached the IV line, Rex's behavior shifted dramatically. His body would tense, his eyes would lock onto their movements, and a low growl would begin to rumble in his chest. What was happening inside that hospital room would soon turn into a mystery that reached far beyond medicine. The bond between Daniel and Rex, forged through years of partnership and strengthened by shared danger, was about to become the thin line between justice and a carefully planned murder. The corruption case that had put Daniel in the hospital was more complex than anyone had realized. The suspects they'd been pursuing weren't just small-time criminals. They were part of a network that included people in positions of trust and authority. People who wore uniforms, carried badges, and had access to places where vulnerable witnesses might be found. Rex sensed all of this in ways that transcended human understanding. His loyalty to Daniel wasn't just emotional, it was professional, tactical, and absolute. The German Shepherd had been trained to detect threats, and every fiber of his being was telling him that the threat to his handler wasn't over. As the night deepened and the hospital settled into its quiet rhythm, Rex maintained his vigil. His amber eyes reflected the dim light from the hallway, and his ears tracked every sound that carried through the thin walls. Somewhere in the building, people were moving with purposes that had nothing to do with healing. The dog who had once saved his handler from an explosion was preparing to do it again, this time from an enemy that hid behind a medical mask and carried poison instead of bombs. The pattern became impossible to ignore by the third night. Each time Nurse Sarah Collins approached, the IV Rex rose to his feet with mechanical precision, positioning himself between her and Daniel's bedside. His low growls vibrated through his chest like a warning siren that only she seemed to trigger. Dr. Martinez had initially dismissed it as overprotectiveness, but Rex's behavior was too specific, too targeted to be random anxiety. The dog allowed Dr. Patel to check the IV connections without incident. Nurse Patricia Williams could adjust Daniel's position and check his bandages, while Rex watched calmly from his post beside the bed. Even the cleaning staff could work around the room without triggering the German Shepherd's defensive response. But with Sarah Collins, everything changed. The moment she entered the room, Rex's entire demeanor shifted. His amber eyes would lock onto her movements, tracking her with the intensity of a predator watching prey. His body language spoke volumes to anyone trained to read animal behavior. This wasn't fear or confusion. This was recognition of a threat. "I've been a nurse for 15 years," Sarah complained to Dr. Martinez after another failed attempt to check Daniel's IV. "I've never encountered anything like this. The dog seems to have developed some kind of fixation." Dr. Martinez studied the situation with growing unease. Rex was a professionally trained police dog, not a household pet driven by random emotions. His behavior suggested training and instinct working in perfect harmony to identify something that human senses couldn't detect. Meanwhile, Daniel's condition had begun to fluctuate in ways that concerned the medical team. After several days of steady improvement, his recovery had stalled. his vital signs would spike unexpectedly, setting off alarms that brought staff rushing to his room. His blood pressure would surge without apparent cause, then gradually return to normal levels over the following hours. The timing was troubling. These episodes seemed to occur most frequently during the night shifts, when fewer staff members were present and the hospital's usual bustling activity had quieted. To a whisper, Dr. Martinez had ordered additional blood tests, but the results showed nothing unusual, no signs of infection, no indication of complications from his injuries. But there was another pattern that only Rex seemed to recognize. Each time Daniel's condition destabilized, it followed shortly after someone had made adjustments to his IV line. And each time Rex intervened, preventing unauthorized access to the tubing, Daniel's vitals remained stable throughout the night. Detective Chen had noticed Rex's heightened vigilance during her visits. The dog's behavior reminded her of the way he acted in the field when tracking a suspect, focused, alert, and absolutely certain that danger was present. "Rex isn't just guarding," she murmured to Captain Morrison during one of his visits to check on Daniel's condition. "He's telling us something's wrong." Morrison had worked with K-9 units for over 2 decades. He'd seen police dogs save officers' lives by detecting everything from hidden weapons to improvised explosives. The idea that Rex might be identifying a threat that humans couldn't perceive wasn't far-fetched. It was exactly what the dog had been trained to do. What kind of threat could there be in a hospital? Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he was already considering possibilities that went far beyond medical complications. Chen's expression darkened, the kind that wears scrubs and has access to patients when they're most vulnerable. The corruption case that had put Daniel in the hospital was reaching a critical juncture. The grand jury was scheduled to convene in 2 weeks, and Daniel's testimony was crucial for securing indictments against several high-ranking officers. The explosion at the warehouse had been meant to silence him permanently, but his survival had forced his enemies to consider other options. Whispers had begun among the hospital staff. The unusual behavior of the police dog was creating tension that rippled through the ward. Some nurses complained that Rex's presence was disruptive, making it difficult to provide proper care to their patient. Others argued that the dog's loyalty was remarkable and that his vigilance might actually be protecting Daniel in ways they didn't understand. Dr. Martinez found himself caught in the middle of a situation that seemed to transcend normal medical protocols. His instincts as a physician told him to prioritize patient care above all else, but his experience with Rex's behavior was raising questions that he couldn't easily dismiss. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Dr. Sarah Kim, a veterinarian who consulted with the hospital on cases involving service animals. Martinez had asked her to observe Rex's behavior and provide an assessment of the dog's mental state. "This isn't anxiety or confusion," Dr. Kim concluded after spending an hour in Daniel's room. "Rex is exhibiting classic threat detection behavior. His nose is designed to identify chemical signatures that human senses can't perceive. If he's reacting specifically to one staff member's interaction with the IV line, there might be a very good reason." "Are you suggesting that someone is tampering with the medication?" Martinez asked. Though the words felt surreal as he spoke them, "I'm suggesting that a professionally trained police dog is trying to tell us something, and we should probably listen." The implications were staggering. If Rex was correct, if someone was indeed tampering with Daniel's IV, then the hospital had become the scene of an attempted murder. The sterile corridors and healing atmosphere were concealing a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the institution designed to protect and heal. That night, Captain Morrison made a decision that would expose the truth hidden in the shadows of St. Mary's Hospital. He assigned Detective Chen to conduct a discreet surveillance operation, monitoring the night shift activities in Daniel's ward without alerting. The regular staff Chen positioned herself in an empty room across from Daniel's, using equipment that allowed her to observe the corridor without being detected. Rex seemed to sense her presence, his alertness increasing as if he understood that backup had arrived at 2:17 a.m. Sarah Collins approached Daniel's room with a fresh IV bag. Chen watched through her surveillance equipment as Rex immediately rose to his feet, his body language shifting to high alert. The dog positioned himself between the nurse and the IV line, his amber eyes locked onto the bag she carried. What Chen observed next would shatter the illusion of safety that surrounded the hospital's healing mission. Sarah's movements were subtle, practiced almost invisible to the casual observer. But Rex's heightened senses were picking up details that human eyes missed. The slight difference in the bag's contents, the chemical signature that didn't match the prescribed medication, the German Shepherd's refusal to back down, wasn't just loyalty or overprotectiveness, it was professional detection work. The same skills that had made him invaluable in the field. Rex had found contraband in hidden compartments, detected explosives in seemingly innocent packages, and tracked suspects through urban mazes. Now he was identifying a different kind of threat, one that wore a medical uniform and carried poison disguised as medicine. As Sarah Collins retreated from the room, frustrated by Rex's continued interference, Chen made a secure phone call that would set in motion the investigation that would save Daniel's life. The hospital had become a battlefield where truth fought against deception, and the only witness capable of exposing the conspiracy was a German shepherd, whose loyalty transcended the boundaries between human and animal understanding. The night was far from over, and the shadows in the hospital held secrets that were about to be dragged into the light by a dog who refused to let his partner face danger alone. The storm hit St. Mary's Hospital just after midnight, its fury rattling the windows and casting dancing shadows across the corridors. Lightning illuminated the building in stark, intermittent flashes, while thunder rolled overhead. Like distant artillery, it was the perfect cover for what Sarah Collins had planned as her final attempt detective. Chen watched from her concealment as the night shift settled into their routine. The storm had created additional chaos. Power fluctuations triggered backup generators, and several patients required extra attention due to anxiety caused by the severe weather. In all the commotion, it would be easy for someone to slip into room 314 unnoticed. Rex sensed the approaching danger before anyone else. His ears perked at sounds that human hearing couldn't distinguish from the storm's cacophony. His amber eyes tracked movements in the hallway with laser focus, and his powerful body remained coiled with tension, despite the late hour. At 2:43 a.m., Sarah Collins made her move. She approached Daniel's room carrying a standard IV bag, but this time her demeanor was different. Gone was the frustrated confusion she'd displayed during previous encounters with Rex. In its place was a cold determination that spoke of someone who had run out of options. The corridor was dimmer than usual due to the storm's impact on the hospital's electrical systems. Emergency lighting cast everything in a pale, ghostly glow that created perfect conditions for concealment. Most of the regular staff were dealing with storm-related issues on other floors, leaving the intensive care ward temporarily understaffed. Sarah entered Daniel's room with practiced quiet, moving like someone who had mapped every creaking floorboard and potential obstacle. But Rex was waiting. The German Shepherd rose from his position beside the bed, with fluid grace, his massive frame blocking the path to Daniel's IV line. "Not tonight," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying a hardness that no patient had ever heard "I'm ending this." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small device, a tranquilizer gun designed for veterinary use. The plan was simple: sedate the dog, replace the IV bag with one containing a lethal cocktail disguised as pain medication, and disappear before anyone discovered what had happened. By morning, Officer Daniel Hayes would be dead, and with him would die the testimony that could bring down a corruption network worth millions of dollars. But Rex's training included scenarios involving weapons and threats. The moment Sarah's hand moved toward the tranquilizer gun, he reacted with the speed and precision that had made him legendary in the police department. His powerful legs launched him forward, not to attack, but to knock the weapon from her grasp before she could use it. The tranquilizer gun clattered across the tile floor as Sarah stumbled backward. Rex positioned himself protectively over his handler, his amber eyes never leaving the nurse's face. His growls filled the room like rolling thunder, a sound that carried through the hospital corridors despite the storm outside. "You don't understand," Sarah hissed, reaching for the IV bag she had brought. "He's going to destroy everything." "Good. People will go to prison because of what he knows." She lunged for the IV line, but Rex was faster. His teeth closed gently but firmly around her wrist. Not to injure, but to restrain. The pressure was precise enough to prevent movement without causing damage. It was a technique he'd been trained to use when apprehending suspects who needed to be taken alive. The IV bag fell from Sarah's grasp, bursting open as it hit the floor. The clear fluid spread across the tiles, and immediately Rex's sensitive nose detected what human senses couldn't. Perceive the liquid carried chemical signatures that had no place in a medical setting. Compounds designed to stop a heart while leaving minimal traces for forensic analysis. Daniel's eyelids fluttered at the commotion. His consciousness was returning, faster than the medical staff had predicted, driven by some deep instinct that recognized danger to his partner. Through the fog of pain, medication, and healing trauma, he heard Rex's protective growls and understood that the threat they'd faced in the warehouse had followed them into the hospital. Detective Chen burst through the doorway with her weapon drawn, followed by Captain Morrison and two uniformed officers. The surveillance operation had captured everything. Sarah's approach, her attempt to sedate Rex, and the dog's heroic intervention. "Step away from the patient," Chen commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with far more dangerous situations than a corrupted nurse with a veterinary tranquilizer. "Sarah." Collins raised her hands slowly, Rex releasing her wrist as the human backup took control of the situation. The German Shepherd remained alert, but allowed the officers to secure the scene, his training telling him that reinforcements had arrived. Dr. Martinez arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion and the security alerts that were now echoing through the hospital's communication system. He took one look at the spilled IV fluid and the veterinary tranquilizer on the floor, and the full scope of what had almost happened became terrifyingly clear. "Get that fluid tested immediately," he ordered, though his expression suggested he already knew what the results would show. "And I want a complete audit of every medication that's been administered to Officer Hayes." As Sarah Collins was handcuffed and read her rights, the truth began to emerge. She had been recruited months earlier by the same corruption network that Daniel had been investigating. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Use her position as a trusted medical professional to eliminate the key witness while making his death appear to be a tragic complication from his injuries. "The dog," Sarah said quietly, as the officers prepared to escort her from the room. I never expected the dog to be able to tell the difference. How could an animal know? Rex sat beside Daniel's bed, his massive head tilted slightly, as if considering the question. The truth was that his nose could distinguish chemical signatures. With an accuracy that surpassed most laboratory equipment, the tampering that Sarah thought was undetectable had been as obvious to Rex as a neon sign would be to human eyes. Daniel's hand moved weakly toward his partner, and Rex gently placed his head where the injured officer could reach him. The bond between them had saved both their lives, first in the warehouse explosion and now in the sterile corridors of a place where they should have been safe. The hospital that had been meant to heal Daniel Hayes had become a battleground where loyalty fought against corruption. The storm outside began to subside as dawn approached, but the tempest that Rex had weathered was far more dangerous than any natural phenomenon. Captain Morrison stood in the doorway watching the reunion between officer and K-9. "That dog just prevented a murder," he said quietly to Detective Chen. "Rex didn't just protect his handler, he protected the entire investigation." The corruption case that had seemed in jeopardy now had additional evidence that would ensure successful prosecutions. Sarah Collins's attempt to murder Daniel had been captured on surveillance equipment, and the tampered IV bag would provide forensic proof of the conspiracy's reach into unexpected places as the medical staff worked to ensure Daniel's continued recovery. Rex maintained his vigil with the satisfaction of a job well done. He had faced explosions and armed suspects, but this had been his greatest challenge, identifying a threat that wore the mask of healing while carrying the tools of death. The night of betrayal was ending, but the story of loyalty and courage was just beginning to reach the courtrooms where justice would finally be served. 6 weeks later, Daniel Hayes walked slowly but steadily through the doors of the federal courthouse, his hand resting on Rex's massive head for both physical support and emotional comfort. The German Shepherd wore his official K-9 vest, his badge gleaming in the morning sunlight as reporters and photographers documented their arrival. The recovery had been longer and more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The explosion in the warehouse had left Daniel with injuries that would probably affect him for the rest of his life. A slight limp, occasional headaches and scars that served as permanent reminders of how close he had come to death. But he was alive, and he was ready to testify. Dr. Martinez had been amazed by the speed of Daniel's recovery, once the threat in the hospital had been eliminated. Without the subtle poisoning that Sarah Collins had been administering through the IV line, his body had been free to heal properly. The bond with Rex had provided additional motivation. The dog's unwavering presence had given Daniel something to fight for during the darkest moments of his recovery. The courtroom was packed as the corruption trial entered its final phase. 12 officers, 3 judges, and half a dozen civilian contractors faced charges, ranging from bribery and conspiracy to attempted murder. The network had been more extensive than anyone had realized, reaching into every level of the city's criminal justice system. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh had built her case methodically, but she knew that Daniel's testimony would provide the crucial details needed to secure convictions. The warehouse explosion had been meant to silence him permanently, and Sarah Collins' attempt to finish the job in the hospital had only strengthened the evidence of how desperate his enemies had become. Officer Hayes, Walsh began. As Daniel took the witness stand, Rex settling beside him with practiced calm, "Please tell the court about your investigation into the corruption allegations." Daniel's voice was steady as he recounted months of careful evidence gathering. He described the bribes, the protection racket that allowed drug dealers to operate with impunity, and the systematic abuse of police authority that had infected his department. Rex remained motionless beside the witness stand, but his amber eyes tracked every face in the courtroom with the vigilance that had saved his handler's life. The defense attorneys tried to challenge Daniel's testimony, questioning his memory and suggesting that his injuries had affected his ability to recall events accurately. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, recorded conversations, and the attempted murder in the hospital that had been captured on surveillance. Video when Sarah Collins took the stand as part of her plea agreement, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. She had been recruited by Detective Marcus Webb, one of the ringleaders who had promised her a substantial payment for eliminating Daniel. Before he could testify, "I never thought the dog would be able to detect the difference," she admitted under cross-examination. "I was told that animals couldn't distinguish between different medications through scent alone." Dr. Sarah Kim, the EE, veterinarian who had consulted on Rex's behavior, was called as an expert witness to explain the German Shepherd's remarkable abilities. "Rex's nose contains over 300 million olfactory receptors," she testified. "That's approximately 40 times more than a human being possesses. He can detect chemical signatures at parts per billion concentrations. To him, the difference between legitimate medication and the compounds that Ms. Collins was introducing was as obvious as the difference between water and wine would be to us." The courtroom was silent as Dr. Kim continued her explanation. "Police canines are trained to identify substances that criminals try to conceal. Rex was simply doing what he was trained to do, protecting his handler by identifying a threat that human senses couldn't perceive." Judge Patricia Hernandez had presided over many cases during her 20-year career, but she had never encountered a situation where a dog had played such a crucial role in preventing murder and preserving crucial testimony. "The court recognizes," she said during her final remarks, "that this case has been preserved not just through the courage of Officer Hayes, but through the extraordinary devotion and professional skill of his canine partner, Rex." The verdicts came after 3 days of jury deliberation, guilty on all major charges for 11 of the defendants, with sentences ranging from 15 years to life in prison. Detective Webb, the ringleader, received the harshest sentence after the judge noted that his attempt to murder a fellow officer represented a betrayal of everything that law enforcement is meant to represent. Sarah Collins received 12 years as part of her plea agreement, though she would likely serve additional time for the attempted murder charges. Her nursing license had been permanently revoked, and she faced civil lawsuits from Daniel and the hospital. Outside the courthouse, Captain Morrison addressed the assembled media, while Daniel and Rex stood quietly beside him. "This case demonstrates the importance of the bond between officers and their canine partners," he said. "Rex didn't just save Officer Hayes' life, he preserved the integrity of our entire justice system." A reporter called out, "What's next for Officer Hayes? And Rex?" Daniel stepped forward, his hand resting on Rex's head. The German Shepherd looked up at him with the same devotion and intelligence that had carried them through their darkest moments. "Rex and I are going back to work," Daniel said simply. "There are still people out there who need our help, and we're not done serving our community." The crowd of reporters and supporters erupted in applause, but Rex remained calm and focused, his amber eyes scanning the crowd for potential threats. Even in this moment of triumph, he was still on duty, still protecting his partner and the people they had sworn to serve. Dr. Martinez attended the press conference, still amazed by what he had witnessed in his hospital. In 30 years of medicine, he told a reporter, "I've never seen loyalty like that. Rex knew his handler was in danger when none of us could see it. That dog saved a man's life through pure instinct and devotion." Detective Chen, who had been promoted to lieutenant in recognition of her work on the corruption case, watched the proceedings with satisfaction. The surveillance operation that had caught Sarah Collins in the act had been crucial to the prosecutions, but she knew that without Rex's intervention, there might not have been a case to prosecute. As the crowd began to disperse, Daniel and Rex walked slowly toward their patrol car. The German Shepherd's gait was slightly different than it had been before the explosion. He, too, carried scars from that night in the warehouse. But his spirit was unbroken, his dedication to his handler as strong as ever. The story that had begun with a nurse reaching for an IV line had evolved into something far more significant. It had become a testament to loyalty that transcended, species courage that emerged in the most unlikely places, and justice that sometimes walked on four paws and saw the world through amber eyes. Rex settled into the passenger seat of the patrol car, his official K-9 vest bearing new commendations that recognized his role in preserving both a life and a legal case. As Daniel started the engine, the German Shepherd looked out at the city they protected together, a city that was a little safer because of their partnership. The courthouse faded in, the rear-view mirror as they drove toward their next assignment, but the legacy